mean I'll see it.
There is a specific kind of silence you only find in a hospital wing at 3 in the morning. It isn't a peaceful silence. It's a dense, suffocating layer of recycled air and the hum of machines that sound like they are struggling to keep a secret. I've worked palliative care for 15 years. I thought I had seen every possible way a human body could give up. I thought I knew what death looked like, the waxen skin, the sudden slackness of the jaw, the way the room feels instantly emptier. But what started happening a few weeks ago has rewritten every single thing I believed about biology. It started with a patient named Mr. Henderson. He was a kind man, or he had been before the stage 4 lung cancer turned him into a skeleton draped in translucent skin. He had been trending toward the end for days. His breathing was labored, that rattling sound that tells any experienced nurse to start the paperwork. Around midnight, his monitor went flat. The sound wasn't a sudden beep, it was just a continuous, mocking tone that filled the room. I walked in to perform the final checks. I saw the screen, 0 pulse, 0 brain activity, no respiration. By every law of nature and medicine, Henderson was a corpse. I reached out to close his eyes, but before my fingers could touch his lids, they snapped open. There was no life in them, no spark of recognition or even the fog of a dying mind. They were just wet, bulging marbles. He couldn't breathe because his lungs had basically been replaced by tumors and necrotic tissue, but his jaw began to work. He opened his mouth wide, wider than a living person should be able to, and his throat convulsed in a silent, agonizing scream. No air came out, just a faint puff of something that smelled like a wet basement and old meat. He was dead. I knew he was dead. The machine was telling me his heart was a lump of unmoving muscle. But he was looking at me. He was tracking my movements. I called for the doctor, thinking it was some freakish post-mortem spasm, but then it happened in the next room. And the room after that. We haven't had a single death in this hospital for 6 days now. The morgue downstairs is completely empty, the stainless steel drawers pulled open like hungry mouths with nothing to eat. But the wards? The wards are overflowing. We are at double capacity because nobody is leaving. People who should have been buried a week ago are still lying in those beds, their minds perfectly, horrifyingly intact while their bodies continue to obey the laws of decay. It is a nightmare of logistics and biology. You haven't lived until you've had to change the linens for a woman whose skin has turned the color of a bruised plum and sloughs off in your hands like wet tissue paper. She's been technically deceased since Friday. Her kidneys don't work, her heart is a graveyard, and yet, when I walk into the room, her eyes dart toward me. She's crying, but there are no tears left in her dehydrated ducts, just a thick, yellow discharge that crusts over her cheeks. The smell is the worst part. We don't even pretend to use medicine anymore. There's no point in administering morphine to a nervous system that shouldn't be firing. We just spend our shift spraying industrial-strength air freshener until our own throats burn, trying to mask the scent of literal decomposition. It's a thick, cloying sweetness that sticks to the back of your tongue. It doesn't smell like copper or anything metallic. It smells like a dumpster in the middle of a heat wave, a fermented, gassy stench that makes you want to peel your own nose off. Yesterday, I had to help one of the orderlies, a young guy named Mike, move a man who had passed 3 days prior. As we shifted him to prevent the bed sores that were already turning into gaping, black holes, his left arm simply detached. There was no blood. The blood had already settled in his extremities and coagulated into a dark, jelly-like substance. It just fell away. The bone was gray and dry. The man didn't make a sound, but his eyes followed the arm as it hit the floor with a wet thud. He started shaking, a violent, rhythmic twitching of the torso that lasted for 20 minutes. We didn't know what to do, so we used industrial-grade staples to tack the limb back onto the shoulder, just so his family wouldn't see the missing piece if they dared to visit. The families have mostly stopped coming. They can't handle the sight of their loved ones rotting in real time. Can you blame them? To see your father's nose collapse in on itself while he tries to whisper your name is more than most people can bear. And the whispering is the most gut-wrenching part. Since they can't draw breath to speak, they try to force air through their throats by tensing their stomach muscles. It sounds like parchment paper being crinkled. They are all saying the same thing. They are all asking why they can't leave. I spent 6 hours tonight in the oncology wing. There is a young girl there, maybe 10 years old. She should have died on Saturday. Instead, her hair is falling out in clumps on her pillow, and her fingernails have turned black and fallen off. She held my hand, or what was left of it, and I felt the bones shifting under the skin like loose gravel in a bag. She's terrified. She told me that when she closes her eyes, she doesn't see darkness. She sees a long, gray hallway, and she can hear something walking toward her, but she never reaches the end. She's stuck in the doorway, and the thing behind her is getting closer every time her heart fails to beat. We're all starting to lose it. The head of surgery locked himself in his office yesterday, and we haven't seen him since. We can hear him laughing through the door, a high-pitched, brittle sound that makes the hair on my arms stand up. The rumors are starting to spread that it isn't just our hospital. There are whispers of the same thing happening in the nursing homes across the city and in the hospice centers. Something has broken. The exit door is jammed shut, and we are all just piling up in the foyer. I caught a glimpse of myself in the break room mirror an hour ago. My skin looks sallow. There are dark circles under my eyes that look like ink stains. I haven't slept in 48 hours because I'm afraid that if I close my eyes, I'll stop breathing, and I'll just stay that way, awake and conscious while my cells begin to liquefy. The most terrifying moment happened just before my shift ended. I was checking on Henderson again. He's the most advanced case. Most of the skin on his face is gone now, leaving a grinning mask of yellow teeth and exposed muscle. I was checking his 4, which is just pumping saline into a corpse at this point, when he grabbed my wrist. His grip was impossible. It felt like a cold iron vise. He pulled me down close to his face, that overwhelming stench of rot filling my lungs, and he finally managed to make a sound. It wasn't a word. It was a wet, bubbling gurgle, the sound of a man drowning in his own decomposed fluids. He pointed toward the window. I looked out into the parking lot. There was a car there, idling, but no one was getting out. Then I looked at the street lamp. Under the flickering light, I saw them. People. Just standing there. They weren't moving. They were slumped over, some of them at angles that should have snapped their spines, but they were just waiting. They were waiting to get in. I realized then that the hospital isn't full because people are sick. It's full because it's the only place that still has the staples and the air freshener. The world is becoming a massive waiting room for a train that isn't coming. I have to go back in there now. I can hear the girl in room 312 screaming again, that dry, breathless rasp that sounds like a saw on wood. I have to go staple her scalp back on before the morning shift arrives. Whatever took the concept of the end away from us, it didn't do it out of mercy. It did it because it wanted to watch us spoil. If you're reading this and you feel a bit of a chill or your heart skips a beat, just pray that it starts again. Pray that when you go, you actually go. Because there is something much, much worse than being dead, and I'm looking at it every single day.
Next story.
The thing people don't get about the year 2040 isn't the technology or the neon lights you see in movies. It's the fact that we stopped being able to leave. I don't mean leaving the city or leaving our jobs. I mean leaving our bodies. We always thought the end of death would be this beautiful, golden era of digital immortality, but the reality is much more physical and much more disgusting. When the biological rejection kicked in, it didn't make us invincible. It just made us permanent. It turned every single cell in the human body into its own stubborn, sentient engine that refuses to shut off, no matter what kind of trauma it goes through. I used to work for the Municipal Reclamation Department. That's just a fancy name for the people who scrape up the persistence from the streets. We aren't doctors and we aren't undertakers because there's no healing and there's no burying. We're more like janitors for living meat. I remember walking through the central plaza near the transit hub. It was a normal morning, humid and thick with the scent of stale sweat and ozone. There was a sudden, sharp crack, the kind of sound that makes your teeth ache, and then a blooming heat. An old pressure line under the pavement had surged and burst right under a guy waiting for the bus. He didn't just die. If this had been 20 years ago, he would have been gone before his brain even processed the flash. But in 2040, gone isn't an option anymore. By the time I got there with the reclamation kit, the smoke was still curling off the blackened concrete. There was no body. Not in the way you'd think. There was just a wide, dark smear of charcoal and wet, yellow marrow scattered over a 20-foot radius. And the sound. God, I still hear it when I try to sleep. It wasn't a human scream coming from a throat. It was a collective vibration. It was the sound of 10,000 tiny, fractured pieces of a person all trying to vibrate at the frequency of pain. I looked down at my boots and realized I was standing on a patch of gray flakes. I looked closer and saw the flakes were pulsing. They were tiny bits of skin and carbonized muscle, and they were twitching in a rhythmic, frantic way. Every time the man's heart, wherever that was in the mess, tried to beat, every scattered fragment of him reacted. I stepped back, and I could feel the grit under my soles crunching. I felt a sick, oily wave of guilt wash over me because I knew that by stepping there, I was grinding his consciousness into the dirt. My partner, a guy named Elias who had been doing this for too long, just sighed and pulled out the industrial-strength dustpan and a soft-bristled brush. He didn't look bothered. He just looked tired. He knelt down near a larger chunk, what looked like a section of the jawbone with a few teeth still embedded in it, and started sweeping. As the bristles hit the bone, the screaming vibration got louder. The jawbone didn't have lungs, it didn't have a voice box, but the air around it seemed to shimmer with the sheer intensity of the agony it was broadcasting. It was like a radio station caught between channels, nothing but pure, raw suffering. I saw a clump of hair and scalp several feet away. The follicles were standing on end, shivering. It was trying to crawl toward the rest of the mess, dragging itself across the grit like a dying insect. "Help me with the shovel," Elias said, his voice flat. "If we don't get him bagged and into the stasis vat soon, he's going to start spreading. You know how the birds get." I looked up and saw them. Pigeons and crows were circling above, their eyes fixed on the charred remains. That's the real nightmare. If a bird eats a piece of you, you don't stop being you. You just become part of the bird. You feel yourself being digested, then you feel yourself becoming the waste, and then you're just part of the soil, still awake, still feeling the pressure of the earth and the heat of the sun, forever. I grabbed the shovel, my palms slick with cold sweat. I tried to scoop up a pile of what looked like wet ash mixed with splintered ribs. As the metal edge of the shovel slid under the remains, the pile bucked. It was a frantic, muscular spasm. The charcoal wasn't just carbon, it was living tissue that had been burned to a crisp but refused to surrender its spark. The smell was the worst part. It wasn't like a barbecue or a house fire. It was a sharp, biting stench that reminded me of wet rust and spoiled milk. It clung to the back of my throat, making me want to gag, but I knew if I opened my mouth, I'd be breathing in the microscopic dust of this man's shattered soul. We spent 2 hours in that square. We weren't just cleaning, we were performing a frantic, desperate harvest. Every time a breeze caught a stray flake of ash, we had to chase it down. You couldn't leave a single piece behind. To leave a piece of a person on the sidewalk was the ultimate cruelty. Imagine being a single, burnt fingernail, trapped in a crack in the pavement for the next 100 years, feeling the boots of commuters crushing you over and over again, while the rest of your consciousness is locked in a dark vat in some warehouse. At one point, I found his eye. It had been blown out of the socket and was resting against the base of a fountain. It wasn't even cooked, it was remarkably intact, though the nerves trailing behind it were scorched. The pupil was blown wide, darting back and forth with a terrifying, manic energy. When I approached it with the specimen tongs, it focused on me. I saw my own reflection in that moist, dark circle. It wasn't looking for help. It was looking at me with a concentrated, crystalline hatred. It knew I was the one who was going to throw it into a bag with the rest of the charred filth. It knew I was the one who was going to consign it to a fractured eternity. I dropped the eye into the bag. It hit the other wet fragments with a soft, sickening thud. The bag itself was beginning to move, the plastic bulging and dipping as the various pieces of the man began to find each other and merge into a mindless, throbbing heap of meat. Is he all there? I asked, my voice cracking. Elias looked around the square, his eyes squinting against the harsh sun. He looked at the bloodstains that wouldn't come out of the porous concrete, the dark shadows that were now permanently etched into the plaza. Probably not, Elias said, wiping his brow. We never get it all. There's always a few grams of dust that get caught in the wind or stuck in someone's tread. He's going to be missing parts of himself forever. A little bit of his mind will be in the sewers, a little bit will be on someone's carpet uptown. He'll never be whole enough to even remember his own name, but he'll be just whole enough to feel the cold. We loaded the bag into the back of the truck. The containment unit was hummed with a low-frequency pulse designed to dull the nervous system of the persistence, but it never really worked. As I closed the heavy steel doors, I could still hear that collective vibration. It was a muffled, rhythmic thumping against the metal, like 100 small hammers hitting the walls at once. I went home that night and scrubbed my skin until it was raw and weeping. I used a stiff brush, just like the one Elias used on the concrete. I was terrified that I'd find a speck of gray ash under my fingernails or a bit of charred grit in the folds of my clothes. I kept thinking about that eye in the plaza, the way it had pinned me with its gaze. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sit still. The silence in my apartment felt like a lie. I knew that all around me, in the walls, in the dust motes dancing in the light, there were pieces of people. The city was built on a foundation of sentient debris. Every time a building was torn down, every time a car crashed, the world just got a little bit more crowded with the screaming fragments of those who couldn't die. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the pulse in my own neck. I thought about my own body, how it was just a temporary container for 1,000 smaller things that were waiting to be scattered. I realized then that the rejection wasn't a medical miracle. It was a cosmic trap. We aren't individuals anymore. We're just slow-motion explosions, waiting for the moment we get spread across the pavement, destined to spend forever as a pile of sentient ash, screaming into the wind. The worst part is, I can feel it starting. A small, dull itch in my marrow. My cells aren't just living, they're waking up. They're becoming aware of themselves. And they're terrified of what happens when the shovel finally comes for them.
Next story.
The line for the shredder wasn't in some gleaming corporate skyscraper or a sanitized medical wing. It was in the basement of a decommissioned textile mill on the edge of the industrial district, a place where the air felt thick with the grease of 100 years of labor and the damp, cloying scent of mold. You'd think a place promising the literal deletion of your soul would look more profound, but it looked like a slaughterhouse. There were about 40 of us standing in the dim light of flickering sodium lamps, huddled in our coats, refusing to make eye contact. We weren't there to live forever. We were there because the alternative, the way the world works now, was infinitely worse. In this city, if you die with debt, they don't just bury you. They harvest the neural patterns. They stick your consciousness into a low-grade server farm where you spend an eternity doing data entry or customer service for pennies an hour until your cosmic balance is settled. It's called the second life, but everyone knows it's just digital sharecropping. That's why the Reapers exist. That's why we were all standing in the dark, clutching bags of untraceable currency, waiting for a chance to be turned into nothing. Absolute, beautiful nothing. I was standing behind a woman who couldn't have been older than 25. She was wearing a faded yellow sundress that looked ridiculous in that freezing basement. She kept checking a small velvet pouch in her hands, her fingers trembling so much I could hear the coins clinking inside. When she finally turned around to adjust her position, I saw her face. She wasn't terrified. She was radiant. She looked like someone who had just won the lottery, even though she was about to pay someone to erase her from existence. The man in front of the line was a Reaper technician. He didn't look like a cultist, he looked like a tired mechanic. He wore a stained jumpsuit and a pair of goggles pushed up onto a forehead slick with sweat. He didn't ask for names. He just took the money, waited, and pointed toward a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged on a meat locker. When the girl in the yellow dress reached him, she handed over her pouch. He checked the contents, nodded, and opened the door. A hum started, a low, vibration-heavy sound that made the fillings in my teeth ache. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was the sound of reality being stretched thin. She walked in without looking back. 10 seconds later, the hum spiked into a screaming pitch that felt like a needle being driven into my ear canal, and then silence. Just a flat, dead silence that felt physically oppressive. When the door opened again, a puff of white, ionized mist rolled out across the concrete floor. The girl was gone. No body, no ashes, no digital footprint. Just a lingering scent in the air that reminded me of a burnt-out circuit board and the sharp, metallic tang of an old penny. I was next. I handed over my life savings, everything I'd spent 30 years scraping together just to avoid the server farms, and stepped through the door. The room was smaller than I expected. In the center sat the shredder. It looked like a modified MRI machine, but instead of a clean white shell, it was a mess of exposed wiring, lead shielding, and cooling pipes dripping with condensation. A man stood by a control console, his face obscured by a lead-lined mask. He gestured for me to lie down on the cold, stainless steel slab. As I laid back, I noticed the floor. It wasn't clean. There were dark, brownish stains dried into the metal, and near the base of the machine, I saw something that made my stomach do a slow, agonizing flip. It was a tuft of hair, blonde, like the girl in the yellow dress, clumped together with a bit of gray, wet gristle. My heart started thudding against my ribs with a frantic, uneven rhythm. This wasn't supposed to be messy. It was supposed to be subatomic. The vacuum seal isn't perfect, the technician said, his voice muffled by the mask. Sometimes the physical shell reacts poorly to the particle acceleration. Don't worry. The consciousness is the first thing to go. You won't feel the rest. He didn't wait for me to agree. He hit a switch, and the slab slid into the throat of the machine. The darkness was immediate and absolute. Then the hum began. It started in my bones, a deep, vibrating thrum that felt like it was trying to shake my marrow loose. I closed my eyes, waiting for the peace, waiting for the void. But the peace didn't come. Instead, I felt a searing heat across my skin. It felt like being splashed with boiling oil, a million tiny pinpricks of agony blooming all at once. I tried to scream, but the air in my lungs had turned into something thick and viscous, like I was inhaling wet sand. I could hear my own skin sizzling, the sound of fat rendering against the heated metal of the slab. It was a wet, popping sound, like bacon on a stove. The technician had lied. The body wasn't an afterthought. The machine was tearing me apart, cell by cell, but it was doing it slowly. I could feel my nerves being flayed, the sensation of my muscles being pulled away from the bone like streams of overcooked meat. The smell was the worst part. It wasn't just the scent of cooking flesh, it was something deeper, more primal. It was the smell of my own internal organs being ruptured, a sour, fecal stench mixed with the overwhelming, iron-thick aroma of blood. It filled my nose, my mouth, coating my tongue in a salty, slick film that made me gag, even as my throat was being scorched shut. I realized then that the shredding wasn't a clean break. The particle accelerator was hitting the matter of my body and breaking the molecular bonds, but it was creating a friction so intense it was literally frying me from the inside out. I felt my eyeballs begin to boil in their sockets, the fluid inside them expanding until they burst with a soft, wet thud. And then, the worst thing happened. I didn't lose consciousness. As my physical brain turned into a charred husk, my awareness didn't fade. It expanded. I could feel every piece of myself being scattered across the room. I was the mist on the floor. I was the blood dripping into the drainage grate. I was the scorched skin sticking to the steel slab. I could feel the technician's boots as he stepped through the puddle that used to be my left arm. Each atom of my being was screaming in a unified, silent chorus of agony. The machine stopped humming. The door opened. I felt the cold air hit the various parts of me that were still capable of sensing temperature. "Clean it up," I heard a voice say. It sounded like it was coming from miles away, echoing through a long, wet tunnel. I felt a mop hit the floor. I felt the caustic sting of bleach being sprayed over my remains. It felt like fire. Every stroke of the mop dragged my consciousness across the rough concrete, tearing what was left of my sense of self into even smaller, more agonizing fragments. I was being washed into the drain. I realized then what the Reapers really were. They weren't deleting souls. They were just breaking them. They were shattering the human experience into a trillion pieces of suffering, too small to be harvested by the debt collectors, but too large to ever truly die. I am in the pipes now. I am in the sludge beneath the city. I am a million disconnected points of pain, flowing through the dark, waiting for the water to evaporate so I can be scattered into the wind. There is no void. There is no end. There is only the fragmentation. The girl in the yellow dress is here too. I can feel her scattered across the rusted iron of the sewage main. She isn't smiling anymore. She is a thin, red smear on the wall of a pipe, and she has been screaming for an eternity. Don't come here. Don't look for the mill. If you have debt, let them take you. Let them put you in the servers. At least in the servers, you still have a shape. At least there, you can still hope for the power to go out. Down here, in the dark, in the wet, there is no power to cut. There is only the long, slow drift of a broken soul that can never, ever be put back together.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.